Despite approval for the mosque near Ground Zero, a New York church that was destroyed in the September 11th attacks still has not been rebuilt. St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church stood in the shadow of the Twin Towers, and it was crushed when the South Tower collapsed. Republican George Demos is running for Congress in New York's 1st District, and he calls the holdup in the church rebuilding effort a disgrace. He joins us now by Skype. Mr. Demos, why has the church not been able to rebuild on its original site? It's been a long time at this point.
Well, it's important that we rebuild that church. It's the only house of worship that was destroyed on 9/11, and the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey is putting roadblocks, bureaucratic roadblocks, in the way of rebuilding that church. The Port Authority is an agency that reports to New York and New Jersey, two separate governments, but ultimately is actually accountable to no one. So it's time that people stand up across this country and say, rebuild the church that was destroyed on 9/11.
Now, there was supposed to be a land swap deal where the church would get another piece of land nearby on which to build. Why did that fall through?
Well, as I understand it, there was an accommodation. The Greek church decided that it would agree to the Port Authority's request to move it in order to accommodate a loading dock into Ground Zero, and they agreed to move it, and ultimately the Port Authority reneged on that deal about a year ago, and it has refused to meet with the church leaders for over a year.
How do you contrast the treatment that the church is receiving from the Port Authority and the treatment that the mosque project has received?
We need to make sure we investigate the background of the proponents of the mosque. I'm not sure they're the moderate voice of Islam that they claim to be, and we need to make sure we investigate the funding of that mosque. But it strikes me as very odd and absolutely outrageous that we're facilitating the building of a mosque near Ground Zero. At the same time, we're not doing absolutely everything we can to rebuild that church. That church was destroyed on 9/11. 3,000 Americans lost their lives, including 168 right here in Suffolk County where I'm running. And we owe it to the victims and to the survivors to rebuild the only house of worship destroyed on 9/11.
And who is going to fund the rebuilding of the Greek Orthodox Church?
That comes all through private funding, and the Port Authority does need to pay for the basic foundational work that goes below the church because they'll be building facilities underneath it. But it's absolutely an outrage, and the Port Authority Director, Chris Ward, needs to stand up now and take accountability and help spearhead the rebuilding of that church. We must rebuild it.
So if you're calling to release the donors who will be funding the mosque building, are you also going to release the names of these private donors who will fund the Greek Orthodox Church?
Well, I see no reason why those donors shouldn't be released, but to my knowledge, there have been no terrorist regimes funding the building of a church, so I don't think the comparison holds, but absolutely, there should always be accountability and transparency, and I'm sure that the church would be happy to release their donors, but I'm not sure we can say the same thing about the mosque.
Mr. Demos, what would you like to see happen at this point?
We need to see that church rise from the ashes and the ruins from September 11th, and it has to happen now, and it will only happen if people stand up and say the Port Authority must allow the rebuilding of that church.
All right, George Demos, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.